The glass of water in front of me trembled, because my own hand was shaking, and I could not tell if it was hunger or fear that caused it. Every man at that long table was watching me, waiting for me to lift my fork, because in my world, a man who cannot eat in front of his own captains is a man who looks weak, and weak men do not stay in charge for long. I picked up the fork anyway. I brought a small piece of bread to my mouth. I chewed once, twice, and then my stomach turned so violently that I had to set the fork down and press my hand flat against the table to stop myself from doubling over. Victor, my second in command, watched me from across the table with a face that gave away nothing, though I had known him long enough to see the worry hiding behind his calm eyes. He had been at my side since we were boys running errands for my father, and he was the only man left alive who remembered me before I became what I am now. He cleared his throat and told the others the meeting was finished, that we would continue tomorrow, and one by one, the men filed out of the dining hall until it was only the two of us left with a table full of food neither of us would touch. I am Nikolai Voss. 6 months ago, my father was buried in the family plot outside the city, and on that same day, I became the head of an organization that controls half the ports, most of the warehouses, and more secrets than any man should be trusted to carry. I did not ask for this life. I was born into it the way other men are born into farming or fishing, and by the time I was old enough to understand what my family did, it was already too late to choose a different path. My father taught me that power was the only thing that could not be taken from a man while he still had breath in his lungs. He was wrong about a great many things, but he was not wrong about that. Since the funeral, I have not been able to keep a full meal down. It started small, a loss of appetite that I blamed on grief, but grief does not usually last 6 months without easing even a little. Now I could not finish a bowl of soup without my body rejecting it. I had grown thin in a way that my tailored suits could no longer hide, and the hollows under my eyes had become permanent shadows that no amount of sleep seemed to soften. My own men had started to whisper when they thought I could not hear them, saying that someone had poisoned me slowly, that a rival family had found a way to curse a man from a distance, that the ghost of my father was punishing me for something I had done or failed to do. I did not believe in curses. I believed in poison, and I had every doctor money could buy test my blood, my food, my water, and every surface I touched in my own home. Dr. Whitfield, the most respected physician in the city and a man who had treated 3 generations of my family, sat across from me in my study 2 days after that failed dinner and told me, with real confusion written across his face, that there was nothing wrong with me that medicine could explain. My heart was strong, my blood was clean, there was no trace of poison, no illness, nothing that could account for a grown man wasting away in front of everyone who knew him. "You are healthy, Nikolai," he said, closing his bag with a soft click. "Whatever is happening to you, it is not something I can find with a needle or a scope." "Then what is it?" I asked him, though I already suspected he had no answer worth hearing. He hesitated before he spoke again, choosing his words with the care of a man who did not want to offend the person paying his bills. "Grief does strange things to the body," he said. "So does the weight of a burden a man was not ready to carry. I cannot write a prescription for either of those things." I dismissed him without another word, because I did not need a doctor to tell me that leading a criminal empire at 29 years old was a heavier weight than most men could bear. I already knew that. What I needed was a solution, and doctors, it seemed, had none to give me. That night, I sat alone in the dining hall long after the staff had cleared the table, staring at the empty chair across from me, where my father used to sit and correct every decision I made before I had even finished making it. The room felt enormous and silent in a way it never had when he was alive. I thought about all the men who now depended on me, the families whose survival rested on choices I made, the enemies circling the edges of my territory, waiting for the smallest sign of weakness, and I understood, in a distant and exhausted way, that I was drowning. I simply did not know in what. 3 chefs had come and gone from my kitchen in the past 2 weeks alone. The first one I fired for putting too much salt in a stew that I could barely taste anyway. The second one, I let go because the sight of the food he prepared, rich and heavy, the way my father had always preferred it, made my stomach turn before I had even lifted the spoon. The third one lasted only 4 days before he asked to be released from his contract, telling my housekeeper that he could not bear to keep failing a man who looked like he was starving to death in his own home. I did not blame him. I was starting to feel the same way about myself. My Aunt Elena arrived at my house on a gray Tuesday morning without calling ahead, which was not unusual for her, since she had never once in her life waited for permission to do what she believed was right. She was my father's younger sister, a sharp woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight knot and eyes that missed nothing, and she had been trying to mother me since the day my own mother died, when I was a boy of 12. She let herself into my study, took one long look at me, and set down her handbag with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "You look like a man who has been dug up from a grave," she told me, and I did not have the strength to argue with her. "I am fine, Elena," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. She did not bother responding to that. Instead, she told me she had hired someone, a housekeeper who would also manage the kitchen, a woman she trusted completely because she had known her family for years. I told her I did not need another servant wandering my halls, that I had enough people in this house already, but Elena has never once in her life listened to a word I said when she had already made up her mind, and she made it very clear that this decision was final. "Her name is Marta," my aunt said. "She starts tomorrow morning. Try not to frighten her away before lunch." I laughed, though there was no humor in it, and told her that mostly people did not need much encouragement to be frightened of me. Elena only shook her head and told me that frightening people had clearly done wonders for my health so far, and perhaps it was time to try something different. I did not have the energy to keep arguing, so I let her have her way, telling myself I would send this new woman off within a week, the same way I had sent off everyone else who tried to feed me. The next morning I woke before dawn, as I had every day since my father's death, unable to sleep more than a few restless hours at a time. I dressed and made my way down to my study, expecting the house to be quiet the way it always was at that hour. But instead, I could hear sounds coming from the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the low hum of someone working. I told myself I would simply walk past and let whoever it was do their job without my interference, but something about the sound, warm and steady, and entirely unafraid, pulled me toward the doorway instead. There she was, a woman I had never seen before, moving through my kitchen as though she had worked there for years, instead of hours. She was full-figured, with dark curling hair pulled back from her face, and she moved with a kind of unhurried confidence that struck me as strange, in a house where most people walked on careful, silent feet around me. She did not notice me standing in the doorway at first, too absorbed in whatever she was preparing, and I found myself simply watching her for a long moment before I finally spoke. "You must be Marta," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. She turned, and I expected the same reaction I always got from new staff, the widened eyes, the sudden stiffness, the careful way people spoke to me as though one wrong word might cost them everything. Instead, she looked at me the way a person looks at any other person, with simple, open curiosity, and gave me a small nod as though I were nothing more than a man standing in his own kitchen. "I am," she said, "and you must be the one everyone keeps warning me about." I did not know how to respond to that. In my entire adult life, almost no one outside of Elena had spoken to me with such plain, unafraid honesty, and for a moment, I simply stood there, unsure of what to do with the strange, unfamiliar feeling settling in my chest. I told her, in the coldest voice I could manage, that I did not eat much these days, and that she should not waste her time cooking large meals for me. She only looked at me, unbothered, and told me that she had never once in her life made food go to waste, and she did not plan to start now. I turned and walked back to my study without another word, telling myself that Elena's new housekeeper would learn her place soon enough, the same way everyone else had. I did not yet know that the woman standing in my kitchen was about to become the first person in 6 months who could make me feel something other than empty, and I certainly did not know how much I would come to need her before this was over. By the end of that first week, I had still not sent Marta away, though I told myself every single morning that today would be the day I finally did it. Something kept stopping me, and it took me longer than I would like to admit to understand what that something was. It was the smell coming from my kitchen each evening, rich and familiar in a way nothing had been familiar to me in years, pulling at a memory I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten it existed. On the 4th day, I walked into the dining hall, expecting the usual plate of something plain and forgettable that my body would refuse within minutes. And instead, I found a bowl of soup waiting for me that stopped me in the doorway. It was a simple dish, potatoes and onions and herbs I could not name, but the smell of it carried me straight back to a kitchen from my childhood, to my mother standing over a stove while I sat at a small wooden table swinging my legs, because they did not yet reach the floor. I had not thought of that kitchen in years. I had certainly not expected to be ambushed by the memory of it in my own dining hall, by a woman I had known for less than a week. I sat down slowly, suspicious of my own reaction, and looked up to find Marta standing near the doorway, watching me with the same calm, unbothered expression she always wore. I asked her, more sharply than I intended, how she had known to make this particular dish, since I had certainly never told her. "I did not know anything," she said. "I only cook the way my grandmother taught me, and food like this tends to remind people of someone. I did not choose it for you specifically. It simply seemed like the kind of evening that needed something warm." I did not believe her entirely, but I also could not find a reason to argue with her, so I picked up the spoon instead. My hand did not shake this time. I brought the first spoonful to my mouth, bracing myself for the familiar wave of nausea that had ruined every meal for 6 months. And instead, I tasted something warm and simple and good, and my stomach did not turn against me. I finished nearly half the bowl before I even realized what I had done, and when I finally looked up, Marta was still standing there, watching me with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to unsettle me. "That is the first time you have eaten more than a few bites since I arrived," she said. I did not ask her how she knew that, since the entire household staff clearly talked amongst themselves about the state of their employer, and I did not have the energy to be embarrassed about it. I only told her, in a voice that came out far less commanding than I wanted it to, that the soup was acceptable, and that she could continue making it if she wished. She only nodded, unbothered by my clumsy attempt at both gratitude and control, and went back to the kitchen without another word. Over the following days, a strange new rhythm began to take shape in my house. Marta did not ask me what I wanted to eat, and she did not seem particularly concerned with pleasing me the way every other servant in my life had trained themselves to do. She simply cooked what she believed a person needed, and more often than not she was right. Some nights it was a simple broth with bread. Other nights it was a heavier stew that reminded me, faintly and painfully, of holidays I had not celebrated properly since my mother passed away. I still could not finish every meal she placed in front of me, but I was eating more than I had in half a year, and slowly, so slowly that I almost did not notice it happening, the hollows beneath my eyes began to look slightly less severe. It was not only the food that surprised me. It was the way Marta moved through my house entirely without fear. My men, hardened as they were, still lowered their voices when I walked past, still stepped aside quickly whenever I entered a room, still chose their words with the careful precision of men who understood exactly what I was capable of. Marta did none of that. When Andre, one of my most trusted guards, tracked mud across her freshly cleaned floor one morning, she scolded him so thoroughly that I heard his voice crack with something close to genuine apology, a sound I had never once heard from a man who carried a weapon on his belt without a second thought. "You will not track your mess through my kitchen again," she told him, standing with her hands on her hips, as though she were speaking to a careless child, rather than a man twice her size, who had once broken another man's arm without blinking. I watched the entire exchange from the hallway, and I found myself, against every instinct I had, fighting back something close to a laugh. Andre apologized twice and left his boots by the door for the rest of the week. I asked her about it later that evening, curious despite myself. I told her that most people in this house were careful not to provoke my men, and she only shrugged, setting a plate down in front of me with the same steady calm she always carried. "Your men do not frighten me," she said simply. "I have cleaned up after angrier people than them. A man who tracks mud on a clean floor is not dangerous. He is simply thoughtless, and thoughtless people can always be taught better manners." I asked her, half joking, if she thought the same rule applied to me. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement and not quite challenge, but sat somewhere comfortably between the two. "I think," she said, "that you are a man who has forgotten what it feels like to simply sit down and eat a meal without the weight of the entire world pressing down on your shoulders. I do not think you are dangerous to me. I think you are tired. No one had spoken to me that plainly and longer than I could remember. My men respected me. My aunt worried about me. My enemies feared me. But no one had simply looked at me and named the exhaustion sitting behind my eyes without flinching while they said it. I did not know how to respond, so I said nothing at all, and finished the rest of my meal in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, almost comfortable rather than heavy. The nightmares had not stopped, even as my appetite slowly returned. I still woke most nights somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, my chest tight, my father's voice echoing in my ears from dreams I could never fully remember once I opened my eyes. I had grown used to sitting alone in my study during those hours, staring at nothing, waiting for the sun to rise so I could pretend, for the rest of the day, that I had actually slept. One night, unable to settle the restless static in my mind, I made my way down to the kitchen instead of my study, drawn by some instinct I did not examine too closely. I did not expect anyone to be there at that hour, but I found Marta at the counter anyway, kneading dough for the morning's bread, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows and her hair falling loose from its usual knot. She looked up when I entered, and instead of the startled apology I expected from anyone else caught working at such an odd hour, she only tilted her head slightly and asked if I could not sleep either. I told her the truth before I had fully decided to. I told her that sleep did not come easily to me anymore, that when it did come, it rarely stayed long enough to matter. She did not offer sympathy, and she did not tell me that everything would be fine, the way people so often did when they did not know what else to say. She simply pulled out the stool across from her counter and told me to sit, and then she kept working the dough between her hands while she talked about nothing important at all. The weather, a story about her sister's terrible taste in husbands, the best way to keep bread from going stale in humid weather. I do not remember most of what she said that night. I remember the sound of her voice, low and steady, filling the empty kitchen the way the smell of her cooking had filled the dining hall days earlier. I remember the rhythm of her hands working the dough, patient and unhurried, and how that rhythm seemed to slow something frantic inside my own chest. I remember, most of all, that when I finally looked up at the clock above the stove, it was nearly dawn, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I had gone an entire night without a single nightmare tearing me from sleep, because I had never actually gone to sleep at all. I had simply sat in a warm kitchen, listening to a woman who was not afraid of me, and somehow, that had been enough. I did not tell her what that night meant to me. I was not entirely certain I understood it myself yet. I only stood, thanked her in a voice that felt strange and unfamiliar in my own throat, and went to my room to finally close my eyes for a few real hours of rest. When I woke that afternoon, later than I had in months, the ache behind my eyes had eased for the first time in what felt like an eternity, and I found myself, without quite meaning to, looking forward to dinner in a way I had not looked forward to anything in a very long time. Victor noticed the change before anyone else dared to mention it. He found me in my study a few days later, going over shipping schedules with something close to actual focus, instead of the distracted stare he had grown used to seeing on my face. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, studying me the way an old friend studies a man he has been quietly worried about for months. "You look like yourself again," he said finally, and there was no small amount of relief in his voice, though he tried to hide it behind his usual steady tone. I told him I felt better, which was as close to the truth as I was willing to admit out loud. He asked no further questions, though I could see the curiosity behind his eyes, the same way I could see him glance toward the kitchen doorway whenever we passed it together. Victor had never been a man to pry into matters that were not his business, and for that I was grateful, because I did not yet have the words to explain what was happening to me, even to myself. The household staff began to notice the shift as well, though none of them said anything directly to me. I caught snatches of conversation in the hallways that quieted the moment I appeared, quiet remarks about how the master of the house had started coming down for breakfast again, how the kitchen stayed warm and busy from morning until night in a way it never had under the previous cooks, how Marta hummed old songs while she worked, that no one recognized but that somehow made the entire house feel less like a fortress and more like something closer to a home. I pretended not to hear any of it, but I noticed the difference too. in the way my own shoulders no longer felt quite so heavy when I walked through my own front door. Marta never asked me about my work, and I never offered to explain it. She did not need to know the details of shipping routes or territory disputes to understand, somehow, exactly what kind of pressure sat on my shoulders each day. She simply adjusted, quietly and without comment, cooking heartier meals on the days I came home later than usual, lighter dishes on the days I looked particularly drained, as though she had learned to read the weight of my day from nothing more than the way I walked through the door. I found myself, more than once, wondering how a woman I had known for such a short time could see me more clearly than people who had worked at my side for years. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with one of my suppliers, I came home later than usual, my temper still simmering just beneath the surface, from an argument that had nearly turned into something worse. I expected the kitchen to be dark and empty at that hour, the staff long since finished for the night, but I found Marta still there, sitting at the small table near the window with a cup of tea in front of her, waiting the way no one in my life had waited for me in years. "I thought you would be hungry," she said simply, standing to fetch a covered plate she had clearly kept warm for hours. I did not ask her to wait for me. I did not tell her that most nights I preferred to eat alone in my study, away from anyone who might see the exhaustion on my face. I only sat down across from her, too tired to maintain the careful distance I usually kept, and ate the meal she set in front of me while she sat quietly across the table, asking nothing of me except my company. It was during that quiet, unremarkable dinner, more than during any of the dramatic moments that had come before it, that I began to understand something was shifting inside me that I did not fully know how to name. I had spent 6 months believing my body was failing me, for reasons no doctor could explain. Sitting there in the soft light of my own kitchen, watching a woman who asked for nothing and gave so freely anyway, I began to wonder, quietly and with no small amount of unease, whether the emptiness I had been carrying had never been about food at all. The first thread arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked inside an envelope with no return address, delivered to my front gate by someone who had vanished before my guards even noticed the car. I opened it in my study, while Victor stood at the window, watching the street below with the tense stillness of a man expecting trouble to appear at any moment. Inside was a single photograph of my own house, taken from across the street, with no note attached at all. The message did not need words. Someone wanted me to know they had been watching, and they wanted me to know it without leaving any trace behind that could be traced back to them. Victor took the photograph from my hands and studied it carefully before setting it down on my desk with more force than necessary. "The Castellano family," he said, and it was not a question. We had been circling each other for months, ever since my father's death left our territory looking vulnerable to anyone paying close attention, and Dante Castellano had never once hidden his interest in expanding north into the ports we controlled. My father had kept him in check for years through a combination of old alliances and older threats, but my father was gone now, and men like Dante Castellano had a way of testing new leadership the moment they sensed even the smallest crack in the foundation. I told Victor to double the guards at every entrance and to find out who had delivered the envelope, though I already suspected the trail would lead nowhere useful. Men like Dante did not make mistakes that could be traced back to them. This was not an attack. It was a message, a quiet reminder that he was paying attention to every sign of weakness in my household, and I did not need to imagine very hard what kind of weakness he believed he had found. A boss who could not eat, who had lost weight visibly enough for his own men to whisper about it, who had spent 6 months looking like a man on the edge of collapse, was exactly the kind of target a patient predator like Dante Castellano would circle for months before finally striking. That evening, I sat through dinner, distracted, barely tasting the food Marta placed in front of me, despite how far I had come in the weeks before. She noticed immediately, the way she noticed everything, and set down the plate she had been holding to sit across from me, instead of returning to the kitchen the way she usually did. "Something is wrong," she said. It was not a question either. I told her it was nothing she needed to worry about, business matters that did not concern the running of the household, but she only studied me with that same steady, unbothered patience she always carried, waiting until I finally admitted, in a voice quieter than I intended, that someone was watching my house, and that I did not yet know how much danger that meant for everyone living inside it. She did not panic the way I half expected her to. She only asked, plainly, whether I planned to do something about it, and when I told her that I did, that I always did, she nodded once and told me she trusted that I would keep this house safe. I did not tell her that a part of me was more afraid for her safety than my own, a realization that unsettled me more than the photograph sitting on my desk upstairs. Victor called an emergency meeting of my closest men the following morning, and it was there that Petra, one of the few women in my organization, and someone whose judgment I trusted as much as I trusted my own, raised the idea that had clearly been circling the room for weeks, without anyone daring to say it directly. She suggested that the safest path forward, the one that would send the clearest message of strength to every family watching our territory, was for me to secure an alliance through marriage with the Belmont family, whose territory bordered ours to the east, and whose daughter, Charlotte Belmont, had been mentioned more than once in quiet conversations among the older members of my council as a fitting match for a man in my position. A few months earlier, I might have listened to that suggestion without any real objection. It was, after all, exactly the kind of practical, strategic thinking my father had raised me to value above almost everything else. Marriages between families like ours were rarely about affection. They were about territory, about signaling strength to rivals, about securing bloodlines and alliances that could survive generations of shifting power. I had grown up watching my own parents' marriage function along exactly those lines, a partnership built more on necessity than warmth, though I had never once doubted that they cared for each other in their own careful, distant way. Now, sitting at that table, listening to Petra lay out the practical benefits of a union with the Belmont family, all I could think of was the quiet kitchen at the back of my house, the smell of bread rising in the early morning hours, the sound of a woman's voice filling silence that had swallowed me whole for 6 months. I told my counsel I would consider it, because it would have raised too many questions to refuse outright. But the thought sat wrong in my chest the entire ride home, heavier and more unwelcome than any threat Dante Castellano could send to my front gate. I did not see Marta again until late that evening, when I found her in the garden behind the house, cutting herbs by the last light of the day, with the same unhurried calm she brought to everything she did. I stood at the edge of the small stone path for a long moment, watching her work, before she finally noticed me and asked, with a small smile, whether I had come to help or simply to watch her make dinner difficult for myself by standing in the way. I told her, without meaning to, about the meeting that afternoon, about the Belmont family, about the practical logic of an alliance built through marriage rather than affection. She listened, without interrupting, her hands still moving through the herbs, and when I finished, she did not offer an opinion the way I half expected her to. She only asked, quietly, whether that was the kind of life I wanted for myself. I told her it did not matter what I wanted. Men in my position did not get to choose based on what they wanted. They chose based on what kept their people safe, what kept their territory secure, what ensured the next 20 years would not collapse into war the moment a rival sensed an opening. She set down the herbs she had been cutting and looked at me directly, in that same plain, unafraid way she had looked at me on the very first morning we met. "That sounds like a very lonely way to live," she said. And there was no judgment in her voice, only a kind of quiet sadness that struck me harder than any accusation could have. I did not have an answer for her. I only stood there in the fading light, feeling the weight of everything I had inherited pressing down on my chest, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I found myself wondering whether the emptiness that had nearly hollowed me out these past 6 months had never been about grief at all, but about the slow, suffocating realization that I was destined to spend the rest of my life surrounded by people who feared me or needed something from me, without a single person who simply wanted to sit across from me because they chose to. The days that followed brought no answers, only more tension. Victor reported increased activity along our eastern border, trucks that did not belong to any of our known partners, faces that appeared and disappeared too quickly for our men to identify. Dante Castellano was testing us, probing for weaknesses, the same way a predator circles a wounded animal, before finally deciding it is safe enough to strike. And every report that came across my desk made the idea of the Belmont alliance feel less like a choice and more like an inevitability I could not avoid forever. Through all of it, Marta remained the one steady point in a household that felt increasingly like it was holding its breath. She continued cooking as though nothing had changed, continued humming her old songs while she worked, continued setting a plate in front of me each evening with the same quiet patience she always had. I found myself, more than once, watching her from the doorway before announcing my presence, struck by how effortlessly she had become woven into the rhythm of my house in the space of a few short weeks, and how unbearable the thought of losing that rhythm had become. One night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of me, I found her again in the kitchen, kneading dough in the quiet hours before dawn, the same way she had that first sleepless night weeks earlier. She did not ask what was wrong this time. She only pulled out the stool across from her and waited for me to sit, and I found myself, without any real decision to do so, telling her things I had never said aloud to anyone, not even Victor. I told her about my father, about the cold, exacting way he had raised me to believe that softness was a weakness that would get me killed. I told her about the nightmares that still visited me most nights, my father's voice repeating the same disappointed words, no matter how many times I tried to prove myself worthy of the empire he left behind. I told her, finally, about the strange, hollow fear that had been growing inside me since the day of his funeral, the fear that I would spend the rest of my life exactly as alone as I felt in that moment, surrounded by loyal men and strategic alliances, and no one, not a single person, who truly knew me. She listened to all of it without flinching, without offering the kind of hollow comfort people so often reach for when they do not know what else to say. When I finally finished, she reached across the small counter and rested her hand briefly over mine, warm and steady, and told me that a man who could speak so honestly about his own fear was not nearly as hollow as he believed himself to be. It was such a small gesture, barely a few seconds of contact, but it settled something in my chest that had been shaking loose for months, and for the first time since my father's death, I did not feel entirely alone in the weight I carried. The following afternoon, Elena arrived at my house again without warning, though this time her visit had nothing to do with hiring new staff. She found me in my study, reviewing reports on the Castellano movements along our border, and she sat down across from me with the same sharp, assessing look she had given me weeks earlier, before Marta had ever set foot in my kitchen. "You look different," she said, studying my face carefully. "Not just healthier, something else." I told her I did not know what she meant, though I suspected I understood exactly what she was seeing. She did not push the matter, not directly, but she mentioned, in the careful, roundabout way she had perfected over decades of managing difficult men in our family, that she had heard whispers among the staff about how much time I had been spending in the kitchen lately, how the whole house seemed to breathe easier since Marta had arrived. I told her the staff talked too much, and she laughed, a short, genuine sound I had not heard from her in longer than I could remember, and told me that staff always talked, and that sometimes what they said was worth listening to. Before she left, she brought up the Belmont Alliance herself, telling me that Petra had already reached out to her privately about the idea, hoping Elena might help convince me of its merits. I told her I had not made any decisions yet, and she studied me for a long moment, before saying something I did not expect from a woman who had spent her whole life believing in the importance of strategic marriages within our world. "Your father built alliances out of necessity, because he never had another choice," she said. "But necessity is not the same as destiny, Nikolai. Do not mistake one for the other simply because it is easier than asking yourself what you actually want." I did not know how to respond to that, and she did not wait for an answer, gathering her things and leaving with the same brisk efficiency she had arrived with, leaving me alone with a study full of border reports and a mind that kept drifting, against every effort I made to focus, back toward the kitchen at the rear of the house. 2 days later, the tension along our eastern border finally broke into something more concrete. Victor came to me with word that one of our smaller warehouses near the docks had been approached by men we did not recognize, asking careful, probing questions about our shipment schedules to anyone willing to talk. It was not an attack, not yet, but it was close enough to one that I called every senior member of my organization together that evening to discuss how we would respond. Petra argued for a show of force, a message sent back to the Castellano family making clear that any further probing would be met with consequences. Victor, more cautious by nature, suggested we tighten our own defenses first, and gather more information before committing to anything that might escalate a situation we did not yet fully understand. I listened to both arguments carefully, weighing the kind of decision my father would have made without hesitation against the kind of decision that might actually keep the people I was responsible for safe, and I found myself, for the first time since taking over the family, genuinely uncertain which path to choose. In the past, uncertainty like that would have eaten away at me for days, feeding directly into whatever had been hollowing me out since my father's funeral. Now, strangely, I found the uncertainty easier to sit with, easier to think through clearly, and I understood, somewhere in the back of my mind, that the difference was not the situation itself, but the fact that I no longer felt quite so alone carrying the weight of it. I chose Victor's more cautious approach, ordering increased security at every warehouse and dock under our control, while quietly gathering information on exactly who had been asking those questions, and who they answered to. It was not the bold, aggressive response my father might have chosen, but it was, I believed, the right one. And for the first time in months I made a major decision for my organization without feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that had accompanied nearly every choice I had made since inheriting this life. That night, exhausted from hours of meetings and planning, I came home later than usual to find the house unusually quiet, most of the staff already gone for the evening. I expected to find the kitchen dark, but a single light still burned there, and I made my way toward it, out of habit, more than conscious decision. Marta was waiting, as she so often was now, a plate covered and kept warm despite the late hour, and when I sat down across from her at the small table by the window, I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since the moment Victor first showed me that photograph of my own house days earlier. I told her, in careful, measured words that left out anything too dangerous for her to carry, that things were becoming more difficult, that the coming weeks might bring more tension to the house than she had signed on for when Elena first hired her. I gave her an opening to leave, half expecting her to take it, the way any reasonable person would when faced with the reality of the world I lived in. She only shook her head, unbothered, and told me that she had not spent weeks learning the rhythm of this house, just to abandon it the moment things became difficult. I do not frighten easily, she reminded me, echoing words she had said to me weeks earlier about my own men, and something about hearing her say it again, now, with real danger circling closer than it had before, settled a fear in my chest I had not even fully admitted to carrying. I did not know, sitting in that quiet kitchen as the last of the evening light faded from the windows, how soon that fragile peace would be tested. I did not know that the danger circling my territory was about to move much closer to home than any of us had prepared for, or that the woman sitting across from me, the one who had somehow become the only steady thing in my entire world, was about to be pulled directly into the storm I had spent my whole life trying to survive. The call came in just after midnight, and I knew from the sound of Victor's voice alone that something had gone badly wrong before he said a single word of explanation. There had been an incident near the eastern warehouse, he told me, gunfire exchanged between our men and a group that had approached under cover of darkness, and in the chaos of the confrontation, a stray shot had struck the delivery vehicle that had been making its way back toward the main house that evening, a vehicle Marta had been riding in after visiting her sister across town. I do not remember getting dressed. I do not remember the drive to the hospital, though Victor told me afterward that I had gotten into the car so quickly he barely had time to grab his keys before I was already halfway down the driveway. I remember only the sterile white light of the hospital corridor and the unbearable stretch of minutes waiting for a doctor to tell me whether the woman who had spent weeks pulling me back from the edge of my own collapse was going to be all right. She was, in the end, though it did not feel that way in those first agonizing minutes. The bullet had grazed her shoulder, rather than striking anything vital, a wound that would heal within weeks with proper care. But the sight of her lying in that hospital bed, pale and still beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, broke something open in me that I had spent my whole life carefully keeping locked away. I sat beside her bed until she woke, refusing every suggestion from Victor that I should go home and rest, unwilling to leave her side for even a moment. When her eyes finally opened and found mine, the first thing she did, even through the haze of pain medication, was scold me for looking like I had not slept in days, which, I realized with something close to disbelief, made me laugh for the first time since the phone call had torn me from sleep hours earlier. "You are supposed to be resting," I told her, my voice rougher than I intended. "You are supposed to be resting too," she shot back, though there was no real fight in her voice, only exhaustion and the faint, familiar warmth that had become as necessary to me as breathing over these past weeks. I did not tell her, in that moment, everything that had been circling through my mind during the hours I sat beside her bed. I only reached for her uninjured hand and held it, and she let me, and for a long while neither of us said anything at all. It was Victor who finally voiced what I had been avoiding since the moment I understood she would survive. He found me in the hospital corridor the next morning, both of us running on no sleep and too much coffee, and he told me plainly that this had never been meant for her. The gunfire, the confrontation at the warehouse, all of it had been aimed at us, at our men, at the ongoing war of nerves between my family and the Castellanos, and Marta had simply been caught in the crossfire of a conflict that had nothing to do with her at all. "That is exactly the problem," I told him, and for the first time I said out loud the thing I had been circling around for weeks. "She is not involved in this life, Victor. She never asked to be, and she was nearly killed anyway, simply because she was close to me." Victor did not offer easy comfort, because that had never been his way, but he studied me for a long moment, with an expression I recognized from years of fighting alongside him, the look of a man calculating the cost of a decision before it was made. "If you care for her the way I think you do," he said carefully, "then the kindest thing you could do is send her away from this house, back to a life where she is not in danger every time we make an enemy nervous." I knew he was right, in the way any sensible, strategic man would be right. I also knew, standing in that sterile hospital corridor, with the memory of her pale face still fresh in my mind, that the thought of sending her away made something in my chest ache far more than any bullet wound ever could. I did not make a decision that morning. Instead, I focused on the more immediate problem, the fact that Dante Castellano had escalated far beyond quiet threats and photographs left at my gate, and that whatever restraint he had shown before was clearly gone now. Victor and Petra and I spent the following 2 days planning a response, one that would need to be decisive enough to end this conflict before it claimed anyone else who did not deserve to be caught in the middle of it. We learned, through channels I will not describe in detail, that Dante had grown impatient, waiting for his usual methods of intimidation to yield results, and had decided that a direct show of force near our territory would either push me into a costly, favorable to him confrontation, or force me to back down entirely and cede ground along the docks that my father had spent decades securing. He had badly misjudged the kind of man grief and exhaustion had turned me into these past 6 months, mistaking my quiet, careful decisions for weakness, rather than the deliberate patience I had actually been practicing. What he had not accounted for was what those same 6 months had also given me, alongside the exhaustion and the grief. He had not accounted for a woman in my kitchen who had taught me, without ever intending to, that the strength my father valued above everything else was worth nothing at all if it left a man too hollow to protect the things that actually mattered. I went into the final planning session with my counsel, with a clarity I had not felt since before my father's funeral, focused not on proving my dominance the way Dante expected, but on ending this conflict as quickly and as thoroughly as possible, so that no one else close to me would ever again be caught in its crossfire. The confrontation itself, when it came 2 nights later at a meeting arranged on neutral ground between our territories, was tense and careful rather than reckless. I had spent my entire life around men like Dante Castellano, men who mistook caution for fear and confidence for arrogance, and I understood exactly which version of myself I needed to present at that table. I laid out, in calm and measured terms, exactly what continued aggression against my territory would cost his organization, backed by evidence Petra had spent 2 sleepless days gathering, evidence that would prove far more damaging to his own standing among his allies than any single warehouse dispute was worth. Dante was not a foolish man, whatever else he was, and he understood the moment the numbers were laid out in front of him that the cost of continuing this fight far outweighed whatever territory he might gain from it. We reached an agreement that night, careful and unglamorous, the kind of resolution that rarely makes for an exciting story, but that ends conflicts before they claim more lives than they need to. It was not the dramatic victory my father might have sought, a decisive show of violence meant to cement his reputation for years to come. It was simply an ending, quiet and final, and as I drove home in the gray hours before dawn, I understood that I had made exactly the kind of decision the old version of myself, hollow and exhausted and grieving, would never have had the clarity to make. I went straight to the hospital from that meeting, still in the same clothes I had worn to the negotiation, and found Marta awake and sitting up in her bed, her shoulder bandaged but her color returning, her usual steady patience intact despite everything she had been through. She took one look at my face and asked, quietly, whether it was finished. "It is finished," I told her, and something in my chest, some knot that had been tightening for weeks, finally began to loosen. She studied me for a long moment before speaking again, and when she did, there was an edge to her voice I had not heard from her before, something closer to genuine anger than the calm patience she usually carried. "You brought danger to my door, Nikolai," she said. "I was not part of this world before Elena sent me to your house. I did not ask to be caught in the middle of whatever war you carry with you. I did not try to defend myself, because I knew she was right, and because the fear of nearly losing her had taught me more about the weight of my own life than 6 months of grief ever had. I told her, honestly, that I understood if she wanted to leave, that I would arrange for her safety and her sister's safety wherever she chose to go, that I would not blame her for wanting nothing more to do with a man whose world had nearly gotten her killed. She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I began to prepare myself for the answer I feared most. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened, though the sharpness had not entirely disappeared from it. "I did not say I wanted to leave," she said. "I said you brought danger to my door. Those are not the same thing, Nikolai, and I think you know that." I did not trust myself to respond to that with the kind of careful, measured words I usually relied on. I only sat beside her bed, held her hand as carefully as I could around the bandages, and let the relief of her answer settle through me slowly, the way warmth spreads through a body that has been cold for far too long. Elena arrived at the hospital not long after, alerted by Victor despite my instructions, to let her rest before delivering the news. She swept into the room with the same brisk energy she brought to everything, took one look at Marta sitting upright and alert despite her bandaged shoulder, and let out a long breath of relief before turning her sharp gaze on me instead. "I send a housekeeper to feed you a decent meal, and somehow you managed to turn her into a woman recovering from a gunshot wound," she said, though the bite in her words did not match the worry still written plainly across her face. She sat beside the bed and took Marta's free hand in both of hers, speaking to her with a gentleness I rarely saw my aunt extend to anyone outside our immediate family, asking after her pain, her comfort, whether the doctors had given her everything she needed. It was clear, watching the two of them together, that whatever bond Elena had built with Marta's family over the years ran deeper than a simple employment arrangement, and I found myself grateful, in a way I had not expected, that Marta had people beyond myself who cared for her safety. Before she left, Elena pulled me aside in the hallway, her expression losing its earlier sharpness and settling into something more serious. She told me that she had watched me change these past weeks in ways she had stopped believing were possible after my father's death, that the man standing in front of her now bore little resemblance to the hollow, exhausted figure she had found in his study only a month earlier. She told me, plainly, that whatever this was between myself and Marta, whatever careful thing had grown in the quiet hours of my kitchen, it was worth protecting properly, not simply as a matter of gratitude for the meals that had brought my appetite back, but as something far more essential to the man I was becoming. "Do not let pride or duty talk you out of something that has clearly saved your life," she told me, and then she left, her heels clicking down the hospital corridor with the same brisk certainty she brought to everything she did. I returned to Marta's room afterward and found her watching me with a curious, searching expression, as though she had heard at least part of what Elena had said through the thin hospital walls. I did not deny it when she asked. I told her, as honestly as I knew how, that these past weeks had shown me something about myself I had spent years refusing to look at directly, that the hollow, wasting sickness the doctors could never explain had never been a sickness of the body at all, but a starvation of something far harder to name, something I had only begun to recognize the moment she walked into my kitchen and refused to be afraid of me. She listened quietly, her hand still resting in mine, and when I finished, she did not offer the kind of easy reassurance I might have expected. She only asked, softly, what I intended to do about it now that I understood it. I did not have a complete answer for her that night, not with her still recovering and both of us exhausted from the events of the past 2 days, but I told her, honestly, that I intended to find out, and that I hoped, whatever shape that answer took, she would still be willing to sit across a table from me while I figured it out. She smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from her since the shooting, tired but genuine, and told me that she supposed she could manage that much, provided I finished every meal she put in front of me from now on without complaint. I promised her I would, and for the first time since the phone call that had torn me from sleep 2 nights earlier, I let myself believe that whatever came next, we would face it together, rather than each of us carrying the weight alone. 3 weeks after the shooting, I stood in my own dining hall for the first time, hosting a meal I had actually chosen to prepare, and my hands were steady, in a way they had not been in over a year. Marta had finally been cleared by her doctors to return to light work, though I had spent those 3 weeks doing everything in my power to keep her from lifting anything heavier than a spoon, an effort she had accepted with far more patience than I expected from a woman who did not take well to being fussed over. The territory war with the Castellano family had settled into an uneasy but stable peace, the kind that would need careful tending in the months ahead, but that no longer kept me awake with dread the way it once had. Dante had honored the terms we agreed upon that night on neutral ground, and my own men had grown more confident under leadership that made decisions based on clear thinking rather than the erratic desperation that had colored my choices during those first hollow months after my father's death. Victor told me, more than once in those weeks, that the entire organization felt steadier now, as though the change in me had rippled outward into everyone who depended on my judgment. But it was the smaller changes that mattered most to me, the ones no council meeting or territory negotiation could measure. I woke most mornings now, without the tight, suffocating dread that had defined the 6 months before Marta arrived. I ate every meal she placed in front of me, not out of obligation, or the careful discipline it had once taken, just to hold down a few bites, but because I had come to look forward to those meals, the way other men looked forward to the best part of their day. The hollows beneath my eyes had filled back in. My tailored suits fit the way they were meant to again. Dr. Whitfield, on his most recent visit, had looked at me with something close to genuine astonishment and told me that whatever had cured what medicine could not explain, he hoped I intended to keep doing it. I had not yet told Marta everything that had settled in my chest during those long weeks of her recovery, though I suspected she already knew, the same way she had always seemed to know things about me before I understood them myself. I had spent those weeks thinking carefully about what Elena said to me in that hospital hallway, about pride and duty and the danger of talking myself out of the one thing that had actually saved my life. I had also spent those weeks thinking about the Belmont alliance, about Petra's careful, practical arguments, about everything my father had taught me regarding the necessity of strategic marriage in a world like mine, and I had finally, quietly, made peace with the fact that I no longer wanted any part of that particular inheritance. I called Petra into my study the week Marta returned to the kitchen and told her plainly that I would not be pursuing an alliance with the Belmont family, that whatever security our territory needed going forward, we would find it through strength and careful diplomacy rather than a marriage built on strategy alone. She was not entirely surprised, I think, watching the careful way she studied my face, before nodding and telling me she would relay the decision to the council. Victor, when he heard, only smiled the small, knowing smile of a man who had suspected this outcome for weeks and had simply been waiting for me to arrive at it myself. The evening I finally found the words I had been circling for weeks, I asked Marta to join me for dinner in the dining hall, instead of eating separately, the way we sometimes still did out of old habit. She raised an eyebrow at the formality of the request, but agreed, and I spent the better part of that afternoon more nervous than I had been walking into the negotiation with Dante Castellano, which struck me, even at the time, as a fairly absurd realization for a man who had built his entire life around remaining calm under pressure. She arrived that evening in a simple dress I had not seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back the way it usually was for cooking, and something in my chest tightened pleasantly at the sight of her, unburdened for once by the weight of an apron or the demands of the kitchen. I had asked the rest of the staff to take the evening off, and I had, with considerably more effort than I would ever admit to anyone, attempted to cook the meal myself, following instructions she had given me weeks earlier, without either of us quite acknowledging what I intended to do with them. The results were imperfect, the bread slightly overbaked, the soup a touch too salty, but she ate every bite with an expression of barely restrained amusement that told me she recognized exactly what I was attempting, even before I found the words to say it properly. When the meal was finished, I set down my own fork and told her, as plainly and honestly as I knew how, everything that had been building inside me since that first sleepless night in her kitchen weeks earlier. I told her that I had spent 6 months believing my body was failing, for reasons no doctor could explain, when the truth had been far simpler and far harder to admit. I had been starving for something no amount of money or power or territory could provide, something I had not even had the words for, until she walked into my kitchen and refused to be afraid of me the way everyone else in my life had learned to be. I told her that the emptiness I carried after my father's death had never truly been about grief alone, but about the crushing realization that I was destined to spend the rest of my life surrounded by people who needed something from me, without a single person who simply chose to sit across the table because they wanted to be there. "You changed that," I told her, my voice steadier than I expected given how unfamiliar this kind of honesty felt in my own mouth. "Every meal, every quiet hour in that kitchen, every time you refused to let my men or my reputation frighten you into treating me like something other than a man who was simply tired and alone. I do not want a strategic alliance, Marta. I do not want a marriage built on territory, or bloodlines, or anything my father would have approved of, for reasons that had nothing to do with actually wanting the person across the table from him. I want you. Not as my housekeeper, and not out of gratitude for saving my life in ways neither of us fully understood at the time. I want you here because I have never once, in all the years I have lived in this house, wanted anyone to stay as much as I want you to stay now." She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, long enough that my chest tightened with something close to genuine fear, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had faced down rival crime bosses without flinching, but who now found himself entirely undone by the possibility of a single woman's answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same warm, steady patience it always had, though there was something new beneath it now, something softer and more open than I had heard from her before. "I did not come to this house looking for anything more than honest work," she told me. "I certainly did not expect to fall for a man everyone warned me was dangerous before I had even met him properly, but I have spent enough time in your kitchen to know exactly who you are beneath all of that, Nikolai. And I have watched you become someone I am proud to sit across a table from every single evening. I am not interested in territory or bloodlines either. I am interested in continuing to watch you eat a full meal without flinching, and in continuing to fall asleep some nights knowing you are finally resting too. If that means staying, then yes, I want to stay." I do not remember standing, only that I found myself beside her chair a moment later, and she rose to meet me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, the silence between us finally comfortable in a way silence had rarely been for me since my father's death. When I finally kissed her, gently, and with far more uncertainty than I usually allowed myself to show anyone, she laughed softly against my mouth, and told me that for a man who ran half the ports in the city, I was remarkably nervous about something as simple as this. I told her that running ports had never once frightened me the way she did, and she laughed again, brighter this time, and the sound of it filled the dining hall the same way the smell of her cooking had filled it weeks earlier, warm and unhurried, and entirely without fear. In the months that followed, our house changed in ways that went far beyond my own recovered appetite. Elena visited often, delighted in a way she rarely allowed herself to show, and even Victor, careful and reserved as he had always been, seemed to relax more fully into his own role, once he saw the steadiness that had settled over the household he had spent years protecting. My territory remained secure. My organization ran with a clarity and confidence it had not known since before my father's death. And every evening, without fail, I sat down to a meal prepared by the woman who had walked into my kitchen unafraid, and had, without ever intending to, taught me what it meant to actually be alive, rather than simply surviving. Andre, of all people, became one of the first to notice the shift in the household beyond myself. He took to lingering near the kitchen doorway some evenings, drawn as much by the smell of whatever Marta had cooking as by the easy, unguarded laughter that had started drifting through the halls in a way it never had under my father's roof, or in the early, hollow months of my own leadership. He told Victor once, not realizing I was close enough to overhear, that working for a boss who actually smiled now made the whole job feel less like standing guard over a tomb. I did not correct him, because I understood exactly what he meant, having spent 6 months living inside that tomb myself before Marta ever arrived to open the windows. Petra, too, seemed to soften in small, unexpected ways once the pressure of the Belmont question had finally settled. She and Marta struck up an unlikely friendship over the following months, the sharp, calculating strategist and the warm, unhurried cook finding common ground I never would have predicted, bonding over card games in the evenings while I reviewed reports nearby, half listening to their laughter instead of the numbers in front of me. It struck me, watching them together, how much lighter this house had become, not because the dangers of my world had disappeared, but because I had finally stopped trying to face them entirely alone. Dr. Whitfield came by the house one final time that autumn, not out of medical necessity, but simply because Elena had insisted he see for himself how thoroughly his patient had recovered. He found me in the garden with Marta, helping her gather the last of the season's herbs with far less skill than she possessed, but with an enthusiasm that clearly amused her, and he stood at the edge of the path for a long moment, just watching before he finally spoke. "I have practiced medicine for 30 years, he said, shaking his head slowly. "I have never once written a prescription for what actually cured you, and I suspect if I tried, no pharmacy in this city would know how to fill it." Marta laughed at that, brushing dirt from her hands before offering him a cup of tea she had already prepared, as though she had known he would need one the moment he arrived. I watched the two of them fall into easy conversation, the good doctor and the woman who had succeeded where all his training had failed, and I found myself struck again, as I so often was these days, by how effortlessly she had become woven into every corner of my life, not just the kitchen where she had first taken root, but the garden, the quiet evenings in my study, the careful, steady rhythm of a household that had finally learned how to breathe. Victor asked me once, not long after that visit, whether I ever worried that the peace we had found, both in the territory and in my own house, was too fragile to last in a world like ours. It was a fair question, coming from a man who had spent his whole life watching alliances shift and enemies rise from unexpected corners, and I considered it carefully before answering. I told him that I had spent 6 months believing strength meant carrying everything alone, refusing to let anyone close enough to see the cracks forming beneath the surface, and that the fragility he was worried about had nearly killed me, long before any rival family ever could. Real strength, I told him, was not the absence of fragile things worth protecting. It was having something worth protecting in the first place, and choosing, every single day, to protect it anyway. He did not have an answer for that, though the small, approving nod he gave me told me he understood it well enough. He left that evening the way he always did, steady and unhurried, and I made my way back toward the kitchen, where the smell of something warm and familiar was already drifting through the halls of a house that had, slowly and without any grand announcement, become a home again. I think often of that first morning, standing in the doorway of my own kitchen, watching a stranger move through my house, with a confidence I found almost unsettling at the time. I did not know then that the emptiness hollowing me out had never been a mystery medicine could solve. I did not know that the cure had nothing to do with the food itself, and everything to do with finally having someone across the table who saw me not as a name or a title or a source of fear, but simply as a man who had been starving, quietly and for far too long, for the one thing money and power had never been able to buy him. I found it anyway, in the last place I ever expected to look, in a kitchen filled with warmth and the sound of old songs, in the steady, unafraid presence of a woman who never once let me forget what it meant to simply sit down and eat and finally feel whole again.